Shattered glass rained across the faded living room rug as 3 heavy-set men kicked through the front door. Julia clutched her 5-year-old son to her chest, backing into the cramped kitchen, while a tattooed debt collector sneered, sliding a switchblade from his pocket. They thought she was just another helpless, broke single mother left to drown in her brother's gambling debts. They had absolutely no idea they had just kicked down the door of Vincent Russo's secret wife. Rain hammered against the cracked window of the tiny second-floor apartment in Chicago's South Side, blurring the neon lights of the liquor store across the street. Julia Hayes stood over the sink, scrubbing grease from a cheap skillet until her knuckles ached. It was just past 11 at night. Her feet throbbed from a grueling 10-hour shift at the diner, but the rhythmic sound of her son Leo breathing softly in the next room kept her moving. He was her anchor. He was the only reason she endured the bone-deep exhaustion, the unpaid bills, and the constant suffocating fear of the past catching up to her. Life had become an endless cycle of counting pennies and looking over her shoulder. She had built this fragile, unremarkable existence from nothing. No credit cards, no digital footprint, and absolutely no ties to the glittering, blood-soaked world she had fled 5 years ago. Here she was, just Julia, just a tired waitress trying to afford winter boots for a growing boy. A sharp, violent crash shattered the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Julia dropped the sponge, her heart seizing in her chest. Before she could even take a step toward the hallway, the deadbolt splintered, tearing the door frame to jagged splinters. The heavy wooden door slammed against the wall with the force of a gunshot. "Where the hell is he?" a gravelly voice roared. 3 men shoved their way into her narrow living room. They tracked mud and wet leaves across the cheap carpet, their sheer size making the small space feel instantly claustrophobic. The man in front, a bulldog of a guy with a thick neck, wearing a cheap leather jacket and smelling strongly of stale cigarettes and damp wool, scanned the room with predatory eyes. His name was Frankie Lanza. Julia didn't know him, but she knew the type. She had spent too much of her life surrounded by men who wore violence like cheap cologne. "Hey, I asked you a question, sweetheart," Frankie barked, stepping toward the kitchen. He kicked over a basket of Leo's toys, sending plastic blocks scattering across the floor. Julia moved instinctively, positioning her body between the intruders and the hallway that led to Leo's room. Her pulse pounded in her ears, a deafening drumbeat of adrenaline, but years of living among apex predators had taught her to keep her face dangerously blank. "You have the wrong apartment," Julia said, her voice eerily steady for a woman whose front door had just been kicked off its hinges. "Get out before I call the police." The 2 men behind Frankie, one tall and wiry with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck, the other thick and holding a crowbar, burst into harsh laughter. "The cops." "That's cute," Frankie sneered, pulling a folded, crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He threw it onto the kitchen counter. "Your piece of trash, brother Kevin. He owes my boss 75 grand, 50 for the poker game, 25 for the interest since he decided to stop answering his phone. We know he's been crashing here." Julia's stomach plummeted. Kevin, her foolish, desperate younger brother, had begged to sleep on her couch 2 weeks ago, swearing he had a job lined up. He vanished 3 days later, stealing the $50 she had hidden in the sugar jar for groceries. She hadn't heard from him since. "Kevin doesn't live here," Julia said coldly. "He was here for a few days and he left. I don't know where he is and I don't have his money. Now get out." Frankie's eyes narrowed. He took a slow, menacing step closer, invading her personal space. He looked her up and down, taking in her worn waitress uniform and the dark circles under her eyes. "Look around this dump," he mocked. "You think I give a damn if he lives here? The paper says this is his address. If he can't pay his blood, pays. That means you." Mommy. The tiny, sleep-filled voice froze the blood in Julia's veins. She turned her head slightly to see Leo standing in the hallway, rubbing his eyes, his worn dinosaur pajamas looking too thin for the drafty apartment. He had Vincent's dark, untamable hair and Vincent's piercing, stormy grey eyes. Seeing him standing there, so small and vulnerable, triggered a primal, terrifying rage deep inside Julia's chest. "Leo, go back to your room. Lock the door," Julia commanded, her tone brokering no argument. But it was too late. The wiry man with the neck tattoo grinned, his eyes shifting to the boy. Well, well, look what we got here. A little leverage." Frankie snapped his fingers, pointing at Julia. "Here's how this works, sweetheart. You've got 24 hours to come up with 20 grand, a down payment. If you don't, my boys are gonna come back, and we're gonna take something worth selling. Maybe you may be the kid." He reached out his thick, calloused fingers, gripping Julia's chin, his nails digging painfully into her jaw. "Do you understand me?" Julia didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Instead, she stared directly into Frankie's eyes. The terrified, overworked waitress vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness that made Frankie's smile falter for a fraction of a second. "Take your hand off me," Julia whispered, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that didn't belong in a rundown apartment. "Or you won't live to see the sun come up." Frankie laughed, a harsh, grating sound, though it lacked the bravado from a moment ago. He released her chin, shoving her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble back against the kitchen counter. "Tough girl." Frankie mocked, though he took a half step back. 24 hours, honey. Sell a kidney. Rob a bank. Turn some tricks. I don't care. Have the cash." He nodded to his muscle, and the three men turned, stepping over the shattered doorframe and disappearing into the rainy stairwell. Julia stood frozen until the sound of their heavy boots faded completely. Then she collapsed onto her knees, pulling Leo into her arms, burying her face in his soft hair. He was shaking, crying quietly into her shoulder. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's got you. It's okay," she murmured, rocking him back and forth on the linoleum floor. But as she held her son, Julia's mind was racing, tearing through her options. She had exactly $142 to her name. Kevin was a ghost. The police were useless. Involving them would only put her in the system. And if her fingerprints or facial recognition hit the database, the men who came for her tonight would be the least of her problems. Because Julia Hayes didn't exist. Her real name was Julia Russo, and 5 years ago, she had faked her own death in a fiery car crash off a winding road in the Italian Alps to escape the suffocating bloody empire of her husband, Vincent Russo. Vincent wasn't just a mobster. He was the absolute authority of the Chicago syndicate, a man whose ruthlessness was legendary, whose wealth was immeasurable, and whose love for Julia was so obsessive it bordered on madness. When they met, she had been a naive art student, swept off her feet by a charming, fiercely protective billionaire. By the time she realized that the blood on his hands was literal, they were already married. Vincent had treated her like a queen. He draped her in diamonds, destroyed anyone who looked at her sideways, and worshipped the ground she walked on. But his world was a cage of paranoia and violence. When Julia discovered she was pregnant, she knew she couldn't raise a child in a home where heavily armed guards stood outside the nursery, and enemies bombed rival restaurants blocks away. She knew Vincent would never let them go. So she plotted for 9 months, hoarded cash, paid off a rogue coroner, and vanished into thin air the week after Leo was born. She had spent 5 years looking over her shoulder, terrified that Vincent's endless resources would find her. She knew that if he ever discovered she was alive, and that he had a son, He would burn the world to the ground to drag them back to his estate. But tonight, the math had changed. Frankie and his crew were low-level scum affiliated with the Moretti family, Vincent's rivals. They were stupid, greedy, and they would absolutely come back to hurt Leo. Julia could run, but she had no money, no car, and a shattered front door. She kissed the top of Leo's head. "Go to your room, sweetie. Get your backpack. Pack your favorite toys and 3 pairs of socks. We're going on a trip." Leo sniffled, looking up at her with Vincent's eyes. "Are the bad men coming back?" "No," Julia said softly, her voice hardening with a dangerous resolve. "Mommy's going to call someone to make sure they never come back." Once Leo was safely behind his bedroom door, Julia went to the kitchen sink. She reached under the cabinet, her hands shaking as she pulled out a false bottom beneath the cleaning supplies. Inside was a small, dusty metal lockbox. She pried it open. Inside sat a single heavy gold wedding band encrusted with diamonds and an outdated, bulky burner phone. She had sworn to herself she would die before turning this phone on. But she wasn't choosing between her life and her freedom anymore. She was choosing between her son's safety and her pride. Julia powered the phone on. It beeped, searching for a signal for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the bars appeared. She didn't need to punch in the number. It was the only contact saved on the SIM card, burned into her memory like a brand. She pressed call. It rang once, twice. "Speak." The voice on the other end was a deep, gravelly baritone that sent a violent shiver down Julia's spine. It was a voice she heard in her nightmares, a voice that had whispered dark promises against her skin in the dead of night. It was the voice of the devil of Chicago. Julia closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Vincent." Silence. Total suffocating silence on the line. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the faint crackle of static. Then she heard the sound of glass shattering on his end, followed by a harsh, ragged intake of breath. "Julia," he rasped, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage, disbelief, and desperate hunger. "My Julia, where are you?" "I need help," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Men broke into my apartment. They're coming back. They threatened my son." The air on the phone seemed to drop below freezing. "Your son!" Vincent's voice dropped to a lethal, monstrous whisper. "Our son Vincent. His name is Leo. Please, I'll come back. I'll do whatever you want. I surrender. Just don't let them touch him." "Who?" The single word was a death sentence. "Frankie Lanza. He bought my brother's debt. He gave me 24 hours. "Give me the address," Vincent ordered. There was no panic in his voice, only the terrifying, calculated calm of a warlord preparing for a massacre. Julia gave him the address of the apartment. "Lock the bedroom door. Sit on the floor with our boy," Vincent said, his voice smoothing out into a terrifyingly soft cadence. "Do not look out the window. Do not open the door until you hear my voice. I am coming, Julia. And God have mercy on anyone standing in my way." Frankie Lanza sat in the passenger seat of his beaten-up Chevy Impala, smoking a cheap cigar and staring up at Julia's shattered second-floor window. The rain continued to pour, washing the grim streets of the South Side. "You think she'll actually come up with the cash, boss?" asked Jimmy, the wiry guy with the neck tattoo, from the driver's seat. Frankie snorted, rolling down the window to flick his ash into the puddles. "Not a chance in hell. She's a broke waitress. But she's pretty. When the clock runs out tomorrow, we take her. Boss knows a guy at the docks who ships girls overseas. She'll cover Kevin's debt and then some. The kid goes to foster care, or maybe we sell him too." Don't matter to me. Jimmy chuckled, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Easy money. 20 minutes passed. The street was dead quiet, save for the hum of the liquor store sign and the relentless rain. Then the street lights at the end of the block abruptly flickered and died. Frankie frowned, sitting up slightly. The hell was that transformer blow? Before Jimmy could answer, the lights at the other end of the block went out too. Total darkness swallowed the street. A low mechanical rumble began to vibrate through the asphalt, vibrating the floorboards of the Impala. Out of the darkness, a pair of blinding LED headlights appeared at the intersection, then another pair, and another. Like a procession of mechanical sharks, 6 midnight black armored Cadillac Escalades turned onto the narrow, pothole-riddled street. They moved with terrifying precision, forming a complete barricade at both ends of the block. The rain hissed against their hot grills. Frankie's cigar dropped from his lips, burning a hole in his jeans. He didn't even notice. The blood drained from his face as he recognized the license plates. No numbers, just solid black plates, with a faint silver crest in the center, a wolf tearing into a crown. "Frankie!" Jimmy stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified child. "Frankie, that's the syndicate. That's the Russo family." "Shut up!" Frankie hissed, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't reach for the pistol at his waist. "Why the hell are they here? This is Moretti territory. They're not supposed to be here." The doors of the Escalades opened in unison. 30 men stepped out into the pouring rain. They didn't wear street clothes or leather jackets. They wore bespoke black suits, long cashmere overcoats, and held matte black assault rifles leveled directly at the Impala. They formed a silent, impenetrable perimeter around the apartment building, their faces devoid of any emotion. The rear door of the center Escalade swung open. A man stepped out into the storm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the predatory grace of a panther. He wore a tailored, charcoal 3-piece suit, ignoring the rain that instantly soaked his dark hair. Vincent Russo didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. He was the weapon. Frankie's bladder betrayed him. He sat in a pool of his own urine, paralyzed by a fear so profound it hijacked his nervous system. Vincent Russo never left his estate on the North Shore unless he was personally overseeing the execution of a rival boss. What the hell was he doing in the slums? Vincent walked slowly toward the Impala, his polished shoes splashing in the puddles. 2 heavily armed enforcers flanked him, ripping the doors of the Chevy open before Frankie could even think to lock them. Rough hands grabbed Frankie by the collar, dragging him out into the rain and throwing him hard onto the wet asphalt. Jimmy and the other goon were dragged out, just as violently forced onto their knees in the mud. Vincent stood over Frankie, the rain running down his chiseled aristocratic face. His stormy grey eyes were entirely lifeless, swirling with a darkness that promised unspeakable agony. "You," Vincent whispered. The word barely cut through the rain, but Frankie heard it with crystal clarity. "Mr. Russo." Frankie babbled, pressing his face into the wet pavement, crying uncontrollably. "I swear to God, I don't know what we did. This is a misunderstanding. We were just collecting a debt, a low-level gambling debt." Vincent tilted his head slightly. "A debt?" "Yes, Kevin Hayes. He owes us. We just came to collect from his sister." Vincent reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black silencer, slowly threading it onto the barrel of a polished silver handgun his lieutenant handed him. "The woman upstairs," Vincent said softly, his voice trembling with a barely contained volcanic rage. "You kicked her door in." We didn't touch her. I swear," Frankie sobbed, lying through his teeth. "You threatened her." Vincent continued his gaze, drifting up to the shattered window on the second floor. His heart pounded against his ribs, an overwhelming surge of possessive fury and desperate relief warring inside him. She was there. After 5 years of hunting ghosts, his wife was 50 feet away. "And you threatened my son." The words hung in the air. Frankie stopped crying, his brain short-circuited. He looked up at the billionaire Mafia king, then up at the squalid apartment window, the horrifying realization crashing down on him like an anvil. Your son," Frankie whispered, his eyes wide with absolute terror. She's nobody. She's just a waitress." Vincent said, aiming the gun directly at Frankie's kneecap, "is Julia Russo, the queen of the Chicago Syndicate, and you just gave her a 24-hour deadline." Thwip. Frankie's scream echoed through the rainy night as the bullet shattered his left knee. Before he could draw breath to scream again, Vincent fired a second shot into his right knee. "Put them in the vans," Vincent ordered, not even looking at the writhing, bleeding men on the ground. "Keep them alive. The basement needs new guests. I'll deal with them in the morning." As his men dragged the whimpering debt collectors away, Vincent turned his attention to the rundown apartment building. The rage that had carried him across the city began to give way to something else. An agonizing, desperate need. He walked up the concrete steps, ignoring the splintered wood and the darkness of the stairwell. He reached the second floor, stepping over the ruined door of apartment 2B. Inside the apartment was dark. Vincent stood in the narrow hallway, his chest heaving. "Julia," he called out, his voice cracking, shedding the monster, and revealing the broken man who had spent 5 years mourning the only thing he ever loved. The slow turn of a lock echoed in the quiet apartment. The bedroom door creaked open. Julia stood there, illuminated by the faint streetlights slicing through the blinds. She looked exhausted, older, wearing cheap clothes, but to Vincent, she was the most radiant thing he had ever seen. And peering out from behind her legs, clutching a stuffed dinosaur, was a little boy with messy dark hair and grey eyes. Vincent fell to his knees on the cheap linoleum floor. He didn't care about the dirt. He didn't care about his suit. He looked at the boy, his flesh, his blood, his legacy, and a broken sob tore from his throat. "My queen," Vincent whispered, holding his trembling hands out to them. "You're coming home." Rainwater dripped from the hem of Vincent's ruined bespoke suit, pooling on the cheap linoleum of the apartment. He didn't rise from his knees. For a man who commanded thousands of loyal soldiers and controlled billion-dollar shipping routes through the Great Lakes, he looked entirely undone. His stormy eyes remained locked on the little boy, hiding behind Julia's legs. Julia's heart battered against her ribs. She had spent 5 years dreading this exact moment, meticulously planning for a phantom threat. Yet seeing the devil of Chicago kneeling in the dirt of her South Side walk-up, stripped of his terrifying aura, and weeping silently at the sight of his son, shattered her defenses. "Vincent," Julia breathed, her voice trembling, "you have to promise me. No shouting. No guards swarming him. He's just a little boy. He doesn't know this world." Vincent slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing total surrender. "I swear it on my life, Julia. I swear it on his." He finally stood, his towering frame dwarfing the narrow hallway. He didn't reach for her, a staggering display of restraint for a man whose possessiveness was infamous. Instead, he gestured toward the open door where his heavily armed enforcers had formed a human shield spanning the entire staircase. "We need to leave now," Vincent said, his voice regaining a fraction of its commanding gravel. "This block is exposed. I have a medical team waiting at the estate." Within minutes, Julia and Leo were ushered out of the decaying building and into the cavernous, leather-scented interior of the lead Escalade. The convoy moved out in a synchronized tactical formation, speeding toward the I-94 expressway. Inside the armored SUV, the silence was thick enough to choke on. Leo sat between them on the plush leather bench, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. He stared at Vincent with wide, unblinking eyes. Vincent stared back, looking as though he were afraid to blink in case the boy vanished like a mirage. "Are you the king?" Leo asked, suddenly, his high, innocent voice piercing the heavy tension. Mummy said she was calling a king to scare the bad men. A muscle feathered in Vincent's jaw. He glanced at Julia, a profound, agonizing gratitude flashing in his eyes before he turned his attention back to his son. "I am," Vincent said softly, offering a tentative, gentle smile that Julia hadn't seen in over half a decade. "But I'm also someone else, Leo. I'm your father. And no bad men will ever come near you or your mother again." An hour later, the convoy passed through the towering, wrought-iron gates of Vincent's Lake Forest estate. The property was less of a home and more of a heavily fortified compound disguised as a sprawling, Gilded-Age mansion. Julia felt a familiar, suffocating weight settle onto her chest as the tires crunched against the circular gravel driveway. This was the cage she had fled. The perimeter was lined with 12-foot limestone walls, topped with subtle electrified wire. The grounds were patrolled by private contractors from Aegis Defense Solutions, armed with suppressed tactical rifles. The driveway featured hydraulic bollards, capable of stopping a 10-ton truck dead in its tracks. It was a fortress, and she was back inside it. As soon as they entered the grand foyer, complete with its sweeping marble staircase and crystal chandelier, a team of staff members scrambled to assist them. Vincent waved them off with a sharp flick of his wrist. Only one person was allowed to approach Dr. William Arrington, the former chief of trauma at Rush University Medical Center, whom Vincent retained exclusively on an exorbitant private salary. "Check the boy," Vincent ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Check him for everything. Shock, malnutrition, bruises. Then check my wife." While Dr. Arrington gently coaxed a sleepy Leo into a lavish downstairs guest suite for a checkup, Julia remained in the foyer with Vincent. The massive mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving them entirely alone for the first time in 5 years. The silence stretched taut and dangerous. "You faked your death," Vincent stated. It wasn't a question. The vulnerability he had shown in the apartment was retreating, replaced by the terrifying, calculated intellect of the syndicate boss. "I buried an empty casket. I burned down the Italian clinic where they told me your car went off the cliff. I tore the city of Milan apart, looking for the people who supposedly ran you off the road. I had to," Julia said, lifting her chin, refusing to cower. "You were suffocating me, Vincent. You killed a man in our dining room 3 days before I found out I was pregnant. You had guards stationed outside my bathroom door. I was going to raise a child in a war zone. I couldn't let my baby grow up thinking that blood and violence were normal." Vincent took a step closer, crowding her space, his massive presence overwhelming her senses. He smelled of rain gunpowder and the expensive bergamot cologne she used to buy for him. "You robbed me of 5 years," he whispered, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum. "You robbed me of his first steps, his first words. You let me believe the only woman I have ever loved burned to death in a crumpled Maserati." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down, and I would do it again to keep him safe. "Look at tonight, Vincent. The violence always finds us. Even in the slums, hiding under a fake name, it found us." Vincent's hands lashed out, gripping her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. Julia gasped, her hands flying to his broad shoulders. His grip was entirely inescapable, yet shockingly gentle. "It found you because you were unprotected." Vincent breathed, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing in desperate relief. "You were in the open. That ends tonight. You will never leave my sight again, Julia. You will have everything you ever desired, but you and my son are never walking out of these gates without me. Ever." It was a vow, and it was a prison sentence. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vincent's private command center on the 3rd floor of the estate, illuminating the floating dust motes. It was 8:00 a.m., but Vincent hadn't slept. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber scotch untouched by his right hand, staring at the sprawling digital map of Chicago projected onto the far wall. The door opened, and his underboss, Matteo Rossi, stepped into the room. Matteo was a ruthless tactician who operated out of the shadows, handling the syndicate's intelligence and counter-espionage. "Report," Vincent commanded, not taking his eyes off the map. Matteo approached the desk, dropping a thick manila folder onto the polished wood. "Frankie Lanza and his 2 associates are singing. The boys at the Navy Pier warehouse didn't even have to employ the heavy tools. The missing kneecaps were highly motivating. And it wasn't a random debt boss," Matteo said, his voice grim. "Your brother-in-law, Kevin. He didn't stumble into an underground poker game in Logan Square by accident. He was invited, lured." Vincent finally turned his gray eyes, hardening into chips of ice. "Explain." "The setup. The bait. Kevin Hayes had a gambling addiction. 3 weeks ago, he was approached at a dive bar in South Loop by a woman on the Moretti payroll who offered him a seat at a high-stakes, unregulated game. The debt, the game, was rigged. Kevin was allowed to win for 2 hours before the house crushed him, extending him $50,000 in illicit credit. The trap. When Kevin couldn't pay, they didn't kill him. They followed him. They watched him sleep on Julia's couch, confirming the address, and then they chased him out of the city. Why go through the trouble of rigging a game for a degenerate nobody?" Vincent asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Because of what Kevin said 6 years ago," Matteo replied. "Before Julia died, Kevin got drunk at the Drake Hotel and bragged to an escort that his sister was secretly married to the wealthiest man in Chicago. He didn't name you, but the escort was an informant for Carmine Moretti." Vincent's grip on the edge of his desk tightened until the wood groaned in protest. "Carmine never fully bought the car crash in Italy," Matteo continued. "He's been keeping tabs on Kevin for years, waiting for a slip-up. When Kevin showed up at that apartment, Carmine sent Frankie's crew to kick the door down, specifically instructing them to threaten the kid to see how the mother reacted. Carmine was probing." Vincent deduced a lethal calmness washing over him. "He wanted to see if the widow was hiding. He wanted to see if I would come running. And you did, boss, with 30 men and 6 armored vehicles. The entire Chicago underworld now knows that the woman in that apartment is yours. Carmine Moretti played us." Before Vincent could respond, the heavy mahogany doors of the command center swung open. Julia stood in the doorway. She had changed out of her worn waitress uniform into a simple, elegant silk robe that one of the maids had left in her suite. Her hair was damp from a shower, but her eyes were entirely dry and burning with a fierce, unmistakable fury. She had heard everything. Matteo stiffened, nodding respectfully. "Mrs. Russo." "Leave us Matteo," Julia said. It wasn't a request. It was an order from the queen of the syndicate. Matteo glanced at Vince, who gave a subtle nod. The underboss quickly exited the room, closing the heavy doors behind him with a soft click. Julia walked across the Persian rug, stopping mere inches from Vincent's desk. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany surface, leaning in. "Kevin didn't bring this to my door," Julia said, her voice shaking with rage. "You did. Your war with the Morettis did." "Julia, do not placate me," she snapped, cutting him off. "I spent 5 years scrubbing toots, serving stale coffee, and looking over my shoulder so my son wouldn't have to pay for your sins. And in one night, Carmine Moretti uses my brother as a pawn to put a target directly on Leo's back." Vincent reached out, wrapping his large, warm hands over hers on the desk. "I will handle Carmine. By midnight tonight, the Moretti family will cease to exist. I will burn their businesses to the ground. I will drag Carmine through the streets of the Gold Coast." "No," Julia said flatly, pulling her hands away from his grip. Vincent frowned, genuinely confused. "No. If you launch a full-scale Mafia war in the streets of Chicago, the feds will raid this estate by the end of the week. They will freeze your assets. They will drag you to federal prison, and the Child Protective Services will take Leo away from me because I am legally dead." Julia's chest heaved as she laid out the brutal reality of their situation. "You cannot solve this with a bloodbath, Vincent. Not anymore. You are a father now." Vincent stared at her, mesmerized by the fierce, tactical brilliance of the woman he loved. She wasn't the naive art student he had married anymore. The South Side had hardened her, forging her into a queen capable of standing toe-to-toe with a monster. "Then what do you propose, my queen?" Vincent asked softly, genuine respect lacing his gravelly voice. "Carmine wanted to draw you out to prove I was alive so he could use me as leverage." Julia said, her eyes narrowing as a dangerous, brilliant plan formed in her mind. "So we give him exactly what he wants, but on our terms." Julia walked around the desk, invading Vincent's personal space. She looked up into his stormy grey eyes, her own filled with a chilling resolve. "We are going to host a gala," Julia announced. "A massive public charity gala at the Field Museum. We are going to invite the mayor, the governor, and every legitimate business partner you have. And you are going to publicly introduce me as your wife, who miraculously survived an assassination attempt in Italy and has been in deep hiding under federal protection." Vincent's breath hitched. "Julia exposing you like that protects me," she finished for him. "If I am a public figure, a beloved survivor in the high society of Chicago, Carmine can't touch me without bringing the full weight of the FBI down on his head. He thrives in the shadows. We are going to blind him with the spotlight." She reached up her fingers, grazing the rough stubble on Vincent's jawline. Carmine thought he was hunting a helpless waitress. Julia whispered, a dark, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "It's time we show him what happens when you corner a Russo." Champagne flowed like water through the soaring neoclassical halls of the Field Museum of Natural History. Beneath the towering fossilized gaze of Maximo, the titanosaur Chicago's elite gathered in a glittering display of wealth and influence. Politicians, real estate tycoons, and tech billionaires mingled under the ambient amber lighting their hushed conversations, creating a low, buzzing hum that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. In a private suite overlooking the grand hall, Julia stood before a full-length gilded mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Gone was the exhausted waitress in cheap polyester. In her place stood the queen of the Chicago Syndicate, draped in a custom, backless emerald silk gown that clung to her curves like liquid glass. Her dark hair was swept up into an intricate, elegant chignon, exposing the delicate line of her neck. But it was the jewelry that truly declared her return. Resting against her collarbone was the Russo family heirloom, a breathtaking 40-carat diamond and emerald necklace that had been worn by the wives of syndicate bosses for 3 generations. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Vincent stepped into the room. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, tailored to absolute perfection, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. The moment his eyes landed on Julia, he stopped dead in his tracks. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia king looked entirely stripped of his armor, reduced to a man staring at the sun. "You are—" Vincent's gravelly voice failed him. He crossed the room slowly, his polished shoes silent against the thick carpet, until he was standing directly behind her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his massive frame sent a shiver racing down her spine. "You are absolute perfection, Julia." "I am armor," Julia corrected, softly, meeting his intense grey eyes in the reflection of the mirror. "Tonight isn't about looking beautiful, Vincent. It's about projecting invincibility. Carmine Moretti will be down there rubbing elbows with the mayor. We have to make him realize that if he touches a single hair on our son's head, he won't just face a mob boss. He will face the entire city of Chicago." Vincent's hands finally came up, resting lightly on her bare shoulders. His thumbs stroked her skin, a gesture of profound reverence. "I have never been more terrified or more in awe of you than I am in this exact moment." "Good," Julia whispered, turning to face him. She reached up, adjusting his silk bow tie with steady fingers. "Keep that fear. It will remind you not to underestimate me ever again. Now give me your arm. We have a war to win." When Vincent and Julia Russo descended the grand marble staircase, the entire museum went dead silent. It started as a ripple, a sudden cessation of clinking glasses and laughter, until a wave of absolute shock washed over the 500 guests in attendance. Reporters invited exclusively for this calculated reveal frantically raised their cameras. The blinding flashes strobed like lightning, illuminating Julia's radiant, unbothered smile. Whispers erupted like wildfire. "She's alive. That's Julia Russo. I thought she died in Italy. Look at the way he's holding her." Vincent's hand rested firmly on the small of her back, a proprietary, immovable force. He guided her through the parting sea of the city's most powerful people. The governor rushed forward to shake Vincent's hand, his eyes wide with astonishment, as Vincent casually introduced Julia, feeding the press the meticulously crafted story of her deep-cover federal protection following a foreign assassination attempt. The lie was seamless, backed by millions of dollars in forged government documents and bought-off officials. From across the room, standing near the Egyptian exhibit, Carmine Moretti watched the spectacle. Carmine was a man in his late 60s, with slicked-back silver hair, a sharp nose, and the cold, dead eyes of a great white shark. He held a glass of bourbon, his knuckles white as bone. His plan had been to draw Vincent out into the streets to provoke a sloppy emotional retaliation that Carmine could use to consolidate power and take over the Russo shipping routes. Instead, Vincent had brought his supposedly dead wife into the brightest spotlight in the city, surrounded by federal judges and news cameras. Julia spotted Carmine. She didn't look away. Instead, she leaned into Vincent's shoulder and whispered, 3 o'clock, by the artifacts. Let's go say hello to our guest." Vincent's jaw clenched, every primal instinct in his body screaming at him to draw the weapon concealed beneath his tuxedo jacket and put a bullet between Carmine's eyes. But he remembered Julia's warning. He nodded, leading her directly towards the man who had ordered his family terrorized. "Carmine!" Vincent said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated with lethal intent. Carmine forced a tight reptilian smile. "Vincent, I must say I am absolutely stunned. We all mourned your beautiful wife. To see her standing here, it's nothing short of a miracle. It's amazing what a woman can survive when she refuses to be a victim." "Mr. Moretti," Julia said, stepping slightly in front of Vincent. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with venom. Carmine's eyes flicked to Julia, sizing her up. He expected a traumatized, fragile girl. Instead, he found himself staring into the eyes of a predator. Mrs. Russo, the city rejoices at your return, though I imagine transitioning back to this lavish lifestyle must be difficult. After spending so much time in, say, the South Side, it was a blatant threat, a reminder that he knew exactly where she had been hiding and exactly who else was still out there. Vincent's hand twitched, but Julia's fingers seamlessly intertwined with his, anchoring him. The South Side taught me a great deal about pest control, Carmine. Julia smiled, taking a sip of her champagne. You see, when rats infest a building, you don't chase them into the walls with a hammer. It's messy. It causes structural damage. Instead, you locate their nests. You poison their food supply. You cut off their water. And you watch them suffocate in the dark without ever lifting a finger. Carmine's smile faltered. The skin around his eyes tightened. Is that so? It is, Julia replied, her voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. For instance, if a rat were running illicit poker games out of Logan Square to trap desperate men in debt, one might decide to buy the mortgage on that building and hand the security footage directly to the FBI task force sitting at table 4. Carmine's face lost a fraction of its color. Or, Julia continued, stepping closer, the emeralds at her throat glittering dangerously, if that same rat was using dummy corporations to launder money through union construction sites on the West Side, one might systematically short-sell those companies into bankruptcy before lunch tomorrow. You have no idea what you're talking about, little girl, Carmine hissed, dropping the facade, his voice a gravelly snarl. Don't I? Julia tilted her head. Check your phone, Carmine. As if on cue, the heavy doors of the museum opened. Matteo Rossi strode into the hall, ignoring the bewildered looks of the elite guests. He walked directly to Vincent, handing him a sleek black tablet. Vincent didn't even look at it. He handed it to Carmine. On the screen was a live feed of Carmine's legitimate shipping warehouses at the Navy Pier. Federal agents in windbreakers were swarming the property-cutting locks and seizing hard drives. You wanted a war, Carmine. Vincent finally spoke, his voice carrying the finality of an executioner's axe. But my wife prefers a slaughter. Every union boss on your payroll was bought out an hour ago. Every dirty cop protecting your rackets has been handed a retirement package or an indictment. You have no money, no muscle, and no friends in this room. Carmine stared at the tablet, his breath coming in shallow, panicked rasps. He looked around the glittering room. The mayor wouldn't meet his eye. The police commissioner had turned his back. The feds are waiting for you at the south exit, Vincent said softly, stepping into Carmine's space, towering over the broken man. They have a 50-page dossier detailing every extortion racket you've run since 2015. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life in a concrete box in ADX Florence. If you ever say my wife's name or my son's name again, I will have the guards in that prison peel your skin off while you sleep. Do you understand me? Carmine's hands shook. He looked at Julia, then at Vincent. The realization that he had been completely, utterly outplayed by a former waitress shattered the last of his pride. He dropped the tablet, turning on his heel, and walked like a dead man toward the exit, straight into the waiting handcuffs of the FBI. Julia let out a long, slow breath, the tension leaving her shoulders in a rush. Vincent pulled her against his side, burying his face in her hair, regardless of the cameras still flashing in their direction. You are terrifying, he murmured against her ear. You dismantled a 40-year empire in a silk dress and didn't even spill your champagne. I told you. Julia smiled, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. I am a mother, There is nothing I won't do to protect my family. The drive back to the Lake Forest estate was draped in a comfortable, exhausted silence. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of Chicago slick and reflective under the glow of the streetlights. Julia kicked off her diamond-encrusted heels in the back of the Escalade, tucking her feet beneath her as she leaned against Vincent's side. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, his thumb drawing lazy, soothing circles on her bare skin. When they arrived at the estate, the heavy iron gates closed behind them with a definitive ringing clang. But for the first time, the sound didn't make Julia feel like a prisoner. It made her feel untouchable. They walked up the grand staircase together, bypassing the master suite and heading directly toward the guest wing. Julia pushed the door open to Leo's room. The room was bathed in the soft blue glow of a nightlight. Leo was fast asleep in the center of a massive king-sized bed, his limbs sprawled out in every direction, his little chest rising and falling in a deep, peaceful rhythm. His stuffed dinosaur was tucked securely under his chin. Vincent stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching his son sleep. The hard, ruthless lines of his face softened into something profoundly vulnerable. Julia walked to the edge of the bed, pulling the thick down comforter up over Leo's shoulders. She pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, breathing in the scent of his baby shampoo. When she turned back to the door, Vincent was staring at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. He held his hand out to her. She took it, and he led her down the hall to his private study. The study was dark, save for the embers glowing in the massive stone fireplace. Vincent walked over to his mahogany desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a heavy iron key. He walked back to Julia and pressed the cold metal into her palm, folding her fingers over it. "What is this?" Julia asked, looking down at her hand. "It's the key to the estate's security mainframe," Vincent said, his voice thick with emotion. "It overrides my biometrics. It opens the gates, disables the cameras, and unlocks the armory. It gives you absolute, unrestricted access to walk out of this house whenever you want." Julia looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Vincent, 5 years ago, I built a cage to keep you safe, and I ended up suffocating the only light in my life," Vincent said, stepping closer, his towering frame dropping to one knee before her. He looked up into her eyes, stripping away the title of king, offering himself completely as a man. "I will never trap you again, Julia. You are my equal. You are my queen. If you want to leave tomorrow, I will pack your bags and send 100 men to guard you wherever you go. But if you stay, if you can forgive me for the monster I was, I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life being the husband and the father you both deserve." Tears spilled over Julia's lashes, tracking down her cheeks. She looked at the key in her hand, the ultimate symbol of freedom, willingly surrendered by a man who used to control everything. She tossed the iron key into the glowing embers of the fireplace. Vincent let out a ragged gasp as Julia dropped to her knees in front of him, framing his face with her hands. "I don't need a key, Vincent," she whispered fiercely, pressing her forehead against his. "Because I'm not running anymore. This is my city. You are my husband, and heaven help anyone who ever tries to take my family away from me again." Vincent pulled her into his arms, crushing his mouth against hers in a kiss that tasted of salt whiskey and the desperate, burning devotion of a 5-year wait. It was a promise sealed in fire and shadow, an unbreakable vow between the devil of Chicago and the woman who had finally tamed him. The debt was paid, the throne was secured, and the Russo family was finally whole. What an absolutely breathtaking journey, From a shattered apartment in the slums to the glittering, dangerous heights of the Chicago syndicate, Julia proved that a mother's love is the most lethal force on Earth. Did you expect her brilliant, bloodless takedown of Carmine Moretti? Let me know your favorite twist in the comments below. If you loved this intense Mafia romance drama, please hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce, unstoppable heroine, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling original audio stories. Until next time, stay safe and stay fierce.